They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them and encompass them on their own act. But there they were in the heart of it, on 'Change, amongst the merchants who hurried up and down, chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches and trifled thoughtfully through their gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had often seen them before. The Spirit stopped beside one little knot of business men. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin, "I don't know much about it. Either way, I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" "Well, last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the man with a yawn. "But what has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose that shook like the gills of a turkey-cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer?" "I don't mind going if a lunch is going to be provided," observed the gentleman, "but I must be fed if I make one." And then there was another laugh. "Well, I am the most disinterested among you all, after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves and I never eat lunch." "I'm not at all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we'd meet. Bye bye." Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked toward the Spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into the street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened, and thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men perfectly well. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had made a point of always standing well in their esteem. In a business point of view, that is, strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said the one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well, Old Scratch has got his own at last, hey?" "So I am told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?" "Oh, no, no. Something else to think of. Good morning." Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the Spirit should attach importance to a conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was in the past, and this ghost was a province for the future. Nor could he think of any one immediately connected with himself to whom they could apply to them, but nothing doubted that to whomsoever they applied, they had some latent moral for his own improvement. He resolved to treasure up every word he heard and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared. For he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue that he missed, and would render the solution to these riddles very easy. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to the usual time of day for him being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in from the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and hoped he saw his new-born resolutions carried out in this. Quiet and dark, beside him stood the phantom, with its outstretched hand, and when he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of the hand and its situation in reference to himself, that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunken, ugly, alleys and archways like so many cesspools disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets. The whole quarter reeked with crime and filth and misery. Far in this den of infamous resort, there was a low browed Beatley shop below the penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor within were piles of heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuge iron of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupt fat, and sepulchres of bones. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in by a charcoal stove made of old bricks was a gray-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtainy miscellaneous tatters hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, all three just burst into laughter. "Let the charwoman alone to be the first," cried she who entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance, if we haven't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place," said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlor. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. Ah, how it shrieks, screets! There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in the place of old hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. We're all suitable to our calling. We're well matched. Come into the parlor. Come into the parlor." The parlor was spaced behind the screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, he put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on the stool, crossing her elbows on her knees and looking with a bold defiance at the other two. "What are odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilbert?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so. Why, then, don't stand staring as if you were afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber and the man together. "We should hope not." "Very well, then," cried the woman. "That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilbert. "No, indeed." If he wanted to keep 'em after the dead, a wicked old screw, pursued the woman, why hasn't he nat why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out there alone by himself. It's the truest word that ever was spoke, said Mrs. Dilbert. It's a judgment on him. I wish it was a heavier judgment, replied the woman, and it should have been, you may depend upon it, if I could have laid my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, O Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We knew pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here, I believe. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe. But the gallantry of her friends would not allow of this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breech first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severely examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked up the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them up to total when he found there was nothing more to come. That's your account, said Joe, and I wouldn't give another sixpence if I was to be boiled for it not doing. Who's next? Mrs. Dilbert was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, two old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. I always give too much to the ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I'll ruin myself, said old Joe. That's your account. If you asked me for another penny, it made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off half a crown. Now, undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman. Joe bent down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, having unfastened many a great knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. What do you call this? Said Joe. Bed curtains? Ah, returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms. Bed curtains. You don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there? Said Joe. Yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not? I certainly shan't hold my hand when I get anything in it by reaching out for the sake of such a man as he was. I promise you, Joe, returned the woman. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now. His blankets? Asked Joe. Who else do you think? Replied the woman. He isn't likely to take cold without 'em, I dare say. I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh? Said old Joe, stopping his work and looking up. Don't you be afraid of that, returned the woman. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about for such things, if he did. Ah, you look though that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it. Not threadbare place. It's the best he had, the finest one, too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me. What do you call wasting it? Asked old Joe. Putting it on him to be buried in. To be sure, replied the woman. Somebody was a fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite becoming to the body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one. Now Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. As they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp, he viewed them with a disgust which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. Ha 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 ha! Laughed the same woman when old Joe, producing a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground. This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive to profit when he was dead. Ha 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 ha! Spirit? Said Scrooge, shuddering from his head to his foot. I see. The case this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this? He recoiled in terror, for this scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncertain bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced around in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon that bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger from Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and he longed to do it, but he had no power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the scepter at its side. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command. For this is thy dominion. But the loved, revered, and honored head, thou cannot turn one hair to thy dread purpose, or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy, and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous, and true, the heart brave and warm and tender, and the pulse of a man's. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound, to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Hard dealing, gripping cares, they have brought him to a rich end truly. He lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, a woman, or a child to say that he was kind to me in this or that. For the memory of one kind word, I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in this room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge dared not to think. Spirit, he said, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me, let me go. Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger towards the head. I understand you, Scrooge returned, and I would do it if I could. But I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power. And again it seemed to look upon him. If there is any person in this town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that person to me, Spirit. I beseech you.